I just wanted to give you a little intro before we kick off tonight's public meeting. This is the final public meeting regarding our sort of year-long effort to do the first ever town-wide historic resource survey here on the town of Irondequoit. I want to thank the support that we've had from the current Evans administration, as well as the previous Fitzpatrick administration, supporting the commission in our efforts in both initially seeking the large grant from the New York State CLG program that funded this work, and then especially many thanks to our sort of year-long collaborators, the town consultants, KTA preservation specialists out of Buffalo, who did a huge and heavy lift in working through this massive project. And many thanks to my fellow commission members for your hours of volunteer work to support the town consultant in accomplishing this fantastic project. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Athen, who was the leader at KTA on the project. Thank you all very much.
Hi everyone, my name's Athen. My name's much longer, but I go by Athen. And I'm going to be talking for probably 15-20 minutes about the survey, what constitutes a survey, and touch on some of the historic aspects that we uncovered while working on it. And I'm going to pass it over to Annie, who's going to talk about the difference between a national register and a local register district, and historic tax credits for a bit. So first, reconnaissance surveys. Reconnaissance level surveys are a preservation planning tool that identify historic properties in a neighborhood. The National Park Service describes them as a, quote, once over lightly inspection of an area that generates a big picture narrative of the distribution of property types, architectural styles, and the character of the neighborhoods, and that lays the groundwork for characterizing the historic character and significance of the built environment in future intensive level surveys and National Register nominations. So the gist is that reconnaissance level surveys provide big pictures so that you can get a sort of broad narrative that you use to test specific cases against for more nuanced analysis later on. The townwide reconnaissance level survey for Irondequoit includes 6 different parts. This is the long table of contents. I'm sure you can't read it from back there, but if you ever when you get a chance to look at the PDF, there's many pages to go through that you can, with hyperlinks that should help navigate. So there's a project overview, methodology, a historic overview that gives the general historical story of Irondequoit from prehistory to today. Then there's a series of historic trends and themes that are specific to Irondequoit, an overview of proposed districts, analyses and recommendations, and then references and a series of appendices with a whole lot of information that the report constantly references. Irondequoit consists of roughly 21,000 buildings. 19,000 of those are residential buildings. Currently, maybe my numbers are very wrong. Are they? No? Okay. Currently, there are already 33 listed resources in the National Register of Historic Places within Irondequoit and 21 locally designated historic landmarks. In order to bring all of these properties together into a single narrative, we engage in historic research, field investigation, and the mapping and analysis of historic and contemporary sources. So historic research is the first step in preparing the survey, though it continues throughout the process. We typically begin by locating historic maps to begin understanding the material and social changes of the survey area over time. And Irondequoit has an uncommonly early map showing parcels and suggesting roads and population concentrations from 1792. Typically, it's the 1850s that these maps start to show up, 1820s maybe. So 1792 is very early for this level of detail, which was cool to see. So this would be approximately Norton Street. And then Monroe County also has some fantastic online resources of digitized maps, including aerial photographs of Irondequoit from 1930 until today. This is a composite of 1970 Irondequoit. You can see there are a few pieces missing, but comparing and contrasting these types of maps has been really useful throughout the process. So we have a series of questions that we attempt to answer when we're thinking about constructing a historic overview. for a reconnaissance level survey. We attempt to answer all of these by analyzing historic maps, early published histories, other materials available, and a variety of local and state archives, as well as history-focused websites. So, for instance, who settled here? Who came later? Why did they come here? So we have 3 maps here. Indigenous settlements, circa 1500 to the 1700s. A map of one of the military campaigns that came from near Irondequoit Bay, and a map diagram that we made as a part of this process that just shows some of the early settlements. The Haudenosaunee, sometimes called the Iroquois Confederacy, was a defense league of nations whose combined territory stretched from the Mohawk River Valley west through the Finger Lakes to the Genesee River, and was formed by the second half of the 16th century, that some have argued earlier. Initially, this incorporated the 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later the 6 nations with the incorporation of the Tuscarora. The Haudenosaunee were the most powerful military and trading group in North America and well into the 18th century, both orchestrating access to lucrative trade routes, leading deep into the continent, at times controlling as far away as the Mississippi River Valley, and demanding tribute from European colonial outposts along the mid-Atlantic seaboard. So colonial European powers established colonies in the Americas early on, but in central and western New York, battled one another frequently for support from the Haudenosaunee, who often switched sides and played the colonial powers off one another. There was a trading post early on established by the French right at the outlet called Fort of the Sands in as early as 1716. I think there's a sign up there already. But there weren't English settlers or English-speaking settlers in the area until much later than that. The intermittent military campaigns of colonial forces, so French and English fighting each other for territory and trading rights, led to increasing awareness about New York's abundant landscape and resources, providing a catalyst for settlers moving across the state. The first settler outpost arrived in the survey area in 1789 as part of the Phelps and Gorham's negotiations with the Seneca Nation, who had to formally relinquish their control of the land in order for Phelps and Gorham to acquire property rights, so they could own the land formally and start to sell it off. It didn't really work out well for them. There's a very long and complicated history around that that's very fun in the report. So the village of Carthage was laid out in 1792. That was the map that we saw earlier. Carthage was right over here. Charlotte was also laid out in 1792. Tryon Town in 1799, and Rochesterville finally arrives in 1812, later named Rochester. We also ask, what were the broad economic, cultural, religious, political, social, and industrial environments? Small picture. So a few of them that were particularly significant in Irondequoit were trading ports. So although many settlements near the Genesee River along the southern coast of Lake Ontario competed for the designation, Charlotte was named by Congress as the official port of the Genesee River in 1805, and all goods at one point in time for the entire Genesee River Valley flowed through Charlotte before they went anywhere else. Land clearance and agricultural activities, so often the very first activity that people engaged when they entered a new area was asheries. So they would burn trees that they were clearing the land for to use for other industrial purposes that they would sell on the market. And then they could start agricultural processes, grist mills and sawmills, and subsistence agriculture, and these eventually gave way to orchards and nurseries and truck farms by the 19th century, which led, for instance, to the prominence of the Rudman family, one-time peach kings of the later 19th century. And then leisure activities, of course, were another major product of Irondequoit, who pioneered in play before it had been fully accepted by a broader Victorian culture. The Bayview Hotel from 1872 would have been a magnificent remnant of this prominence had it not burned like so many other buildings. Other questions: how do these affect the built environment and cultural landscape? So how do those trends affect the built environment and cultural landscape? This is a 1901 trolley map of the greater Rochester area, and I've given you the portion of it that's focused on Irondequoit, and you can see St. Paul Boulevard right there. You can see the old Seabreeze dummy line that went up, and the Glen Haven Railroad that eventually wrapped around DeSotis Bay. You can see the prominent locations named along there. And the biggest reason that I'm showing you this is that as late as 1901, Irondequoit was at least conceived of as entirely agricultural land, other than these specific transportation routes that traveled around it. But you can see some of the remnants of prior historic periods. So you can see where Tryon Town would have been. You can see where Carthage would have been, though it's blurred into Rochester at that point. And you can see Charlotte up there. So these anchors are still present, wrapping the area as new developments shift and change over time. To these broader patterns, we start to ask what stories there are, what role these stories play in driving specific choices for the future, and most importantly, how these stories are manifest physically in the built environment. The link between broad trends, specific stories, and the built environment can get tricky fast because they're often overlapping on top of one another when we're looking at buildings. So the Langworthy Farmhouse provides a great example of overlapping stories evident in physical details. We can look at historic maps, for instance, if we're trying to understand this building, which appears as early as 1852. There at the top, you can see the red dot, and that's when it was named the Langworthy Farmhouse originally. The 1858 map, it's owned by N.P. Stewart. In 1872, it was owned by P. Burdick. In 1887, by W. Culross. And in 1902 to 1918, by Mary Kronsbein, who ultimately sold it to become the Parkwood Tract, which was developed by the General Realty Service into the suburb that it now is, the subdivision that it now is. So that would be one way that we would try to look at this building and make sense of it. Another way is by looking at the physical character of the building itself, in this case, cobblestone architecture, of which there is a nice history here in north central New York, focused on Irondequoit and the surrounding area, and then expanding outwards. Here's a picture of 3 different types of cobblestones, or the way that they go together. And we could look at the lineage of this material and craftsmanship, where it comes from, how it gets deployed in this building, how it compares to other uses of cobblestone with other buildings in the area. That could give us a story about the building. And we might also look at how it related to St. Paul specifically. Here it's Mary Kronsbein in 1918. We can look at its relationship to St. Paul as it changes over time, and as suburbs start to develop around it, that this building, of all buildings, eventually became a model home for modernization in the Democrat and Chronicle is a fascinating little tidbit. And so the house was entirely renovated in the 30s to replace rotten boards with concrete, to install heating and cooling, to install new kitchens. But when looking at the building itself, using any one of these methods of analyzing its history won't really cut it. So we try to bring them all together as much as we can in order to develop these broader trends that are then going to explain the different historic districts or potentially National Register buildings within Irondequoit as a whole. So historic research establishes contexts and themes. This is our broad historic overview that spans from 1600 to the 1970s. And focuses on different types of development or different types of change that are happening in Irondequoit during those periods. We've broken them up based on the way things happened. So I'm reading history textbooks about the area, looking through historic newspapers, looking at privately published books that are available, and comparing them with all these other sources that I just went through. And then we develop a series of trends and themes. These are fairly standard trends and themes, but they allow us to look at a specific type of building or a specific interaction with the community or local culture and cut through this broad historic overview. So you can look at the historic overview from the perspective of agriculture or of leisure or of community planning and development. And so those are all those subsections within the broader report. And then after historic research, we shift to field investigation. So we take our big picture and we drive around first and do a windshield survey where we try to drive as many streets as we can within the area, marking off on the map things that we happen to notice. We go through and seek out individual properties of significance, either ones that we happen upon while we're walking through, ones that were mentioned in the context of historic research, or ones that Chris and the Historic Preservation pointed out to us, which was very helpful. And then as we're driving around, we're also looking for districts that might be there, so large groupings that could be significant for one of many different reasons, and just trying to get a general sense, again, that get a broad picture, now that we understand the history, of how these different things may or may not convey that history still today. And then, what stories do these material resources tell? So this is speaking to the integrity of the individual resources that we're looking at, the buildings of the districts, and whether or not they are intact historically or if they've been significantly altered. Are they significant in terms of one particular thing, like their style or their use of a construction technology, a specific designer or builder, or are they better looked at as a whole or as a group? Significance to the National Park Service gets defined through a series of criteria. To give it any individual definition wouldn't work particularly well for us trying to apply it, so they give us these criteria that we then apply to decide whether or not a specific resource or a specific district is conveying historic character. So there's a lot to talk about there, but if there are questions later, we can go into more detail. Is there sufficient integrity to convey historic meaning? And integrity is defined as the ability to convey significance with specific material in conjunction with a broad narrative of historic context. And then, are there potential individually eligible National Register properties? So the picture down here is of 200 Hermitage Road, and it is a combination of minimal traditional and Tudor revival. It's got characteristics of both, but we have a historic image from the newspaper when it was first built and advertised for sale, and then a picture that I took last month. And this is an example of a building that has significant historic character still. It conveys exactly what it was before today. The setback looks the same, the plantings look the same, the building looks in good condition, and so on and so forth. And then, is there a potential National Register eligible district? So sometimes that can be very obvious. These are two pictures from the Laurelton district that we proposed. They look very different, but they're from the same area, and we can talk more about how they're part of a single district at another moment. But in this case, you can see how these buildings are related. They were likely built by the same developer at the same time. They're built in the same style. They have the same massing, the same setback. And in other instances, this is a photograph from St. Paul. It's not immediately obvious how the buildings are related. They're from different time periods. They have different styles. And this report provides the means for trying to explain why they would or would not be significant in historic context. In this instance, we're arguing that they are significant. And then so in mapping and analysis, we look at another version of what the broad patterns are, and is there a concentration of resources or a potential district. So we might look at the buildings, and if the buildings aren't making a good argument for what's a district or not, we can look at the maps. And so you can see here, this is again the Laurelton neighborhood in 1918 when these subdivisions first appeared. So there's no buildings, or there's very few buildings yet constructed. The red lines outline the different subdivisions that exist. And then in 1924, this massive expansion past Shilford Road. But when we're looking at this, it might look like, 1924 was when it happened. And then you look closer at this, and there's still almost no buildings constructed. So it's just an idea or a plan. And luckily, like I said, Monroe County has some fantastic digital resources. So here's a 1930 aerial photograph of that neighborhood. You can see just how many buildings were constructed and where, which is fantastic to be able to see and compare. And And it's an opportunity for us to reorient or justify or get further into detail about whether an area was significant, when it was significant, where specifically we're talking about, how we're going to draw the boundaries that indicate a district. So we've proposed 6 districts on top of ones that already exist. The black 1 through 6 are already there. So they are, there is an existing listed district, there's some undetermined districts and some eligible districts. And then the dark blue are the ones that we've proposed, which I'll go through quickly. Proposed Seabreeze Historic District with a period of significance between 1879 and 1936. Currently, there are 34 rides, only 2 of which were built before 1936, Flying Turtles and the Jackrabbit. There are 8 commercial buildings as well on that site, and further investigation will reveal exactly which of those will be significant enough to be listed on their own. And again, with the historic photographs, so the actual boundary of Seabreeze has changed a lot over the years. It's pretty firmly established today, but you can see how it used to wrap around the shoreline quite a bit more. The Laurelton District has 1,600 residential buildings, most of which would be contributing. Those are those maps again to show you how it got cut up over time. So in 1911 is when most of the roads were constructed that went east to west through Laurelton. And then in 1924 it expanded, and by 1961 almost all of those lots have been filled with houses. That's the announcement of those roads being cut through that started the period of significance. The proposed St. Paul Corridor Historic District has 4,500 residences in it, roughly. It's very large. The period of significance begins in 1893 when St. Paul was extended all the way to Somerville. Before that, it was St. Paul Street and stopped at Cole Road. It was then called Cole Road. What is it now? Colebrook. Yeah. So that's where it used to stop, and then you'd have to go through some weird shenanigans to get down to the water, where you took a steamboat the rest of the way to Charlotte. And in 1893, they extended it all the way, turned it into a turnpike and an electric trolley, which kicks off this area for residential development. Because it's such a large area, we had to use a whole bunch of different methods to try to figure out the period of significance and where exactly the boundaries were. So we looked at how much got built over time. So USGS maps often for cities include these color washes that say how dense an area is. The more color wash, the more dense. So you can see at the beginning, this first map, Irondequoit is pretty much, there's no color wash on it at all, where they're still designating individual houses. You can see it grow and grow. Here are the series of developments that got added over those years. And then on the right is an aerial photograph that shows where development abruptly stops. So when you're driving through the area, it's not immediately clear that the district would end along that line, but the buildings that came after that particular edge, which is not, it's in the middle of a block, it's not on a street specifically. The development after that has a different historic character, meaning it relates to the historic context in a different way than the buildings that you can see here. So that was one of the edges that we made. And topography plays another major role. You can see how the subdivisions fit into the topography over time, and it's just ease and economy that led to that. But it also helps us find where those boundaries are going to be. Many of these edges are still visible when you're there on site, which is why there's such a pinch right up there. The proposed Arlington subdivision was in many ways the most straightforward. It's only 284 residential properties. It's consisting of 3 closely related subdivisions. You can see how it got built up over time, which set the period of significance, and the character of the houses makes it fairly obvious. Nice and straightforward. The proposed Huntington Hills Historic District. is both obviously a district when we were driving around it and walking through it, but it was historically really difficult to explain how and why, because it doesn't do any of the things that a typical district would do. All of the buildings are very different. All of the buildings have different massing and setback. None of the roads are straightforward. It's unclear why the lots are the way that they are. And it happened over a really broad period of time. So 1920 to 1975, and there's still empty lots, so more homes could be built. There were 4 or 5 that have been built since 1975 as it is. Furthermore, when you're on site, these areas in red are not part of the original subdivision, but they are clearly part of Huntington Hills now. So, the roads fit the topography just right, and the flat spaces in between the topography is where the lots are. So the shape of the lots fits the flat spaces between. The green that you see here are the commons, which were part of the original design of the subdivision. They were intended to be forever wild, not built upon, and they're mostly not able to be built on either. These are very steep portions of land. The yellow are empty lots or lots that are built after 75, and you can see the construction years of all of the others within the district. So this district is proposed eligible because it continues to match the design principles that E. Maurice Trimble set out when he first set the subdivision in 1922, one of which are the rambling, windy roads and the commons. But also there was a deed restriction stipulating that anyone who built a home after the first, I think, 4 or 5 were required to consult with or have their design approved by a designated architect. And that has come to be part of the character of the district because none of the houses look like one another necessarily, and they reflect individual rather than popular tastes. But again, that's why this was a more complicated lift than Arlington. And last is the proposed White City Historic District, 1908 to 1930. 1908, White City had already started by the late 1870s, but it all burned to the ground in 1908. And so following 1908, a lot of new construction happened. That's the beginning of the period of significance. In 1930, the Athletic Association, the White City, Windsor Beach, and Somerville Athletic Association that was founded to look after the grounds after the fire, dissolved when the railroad company that owned the land sold it, so everything shifted to private ownership in 1930. And as a result of the lack of community organization and the private ownership, the things that made White City what it was at the time slowly dissolved. This is also right when the Great Depression really hit Rochester. Many of the houses were built before 1930, more than I would have expected, honestly. Of the 172 residences, 108 were built before 1930 and are contributing to the district. So the Athletic Association used to manage all of that land north of Colebrook. And you can see here on a historic, this is a 1912 Sanborn map, the buildings that were already constructed and the ones that were entirely canvas tents, which is very cool to be able to see in an old map. That's all I have for this bit. So Annie's going to talk a little bit about the National Register and historic tax credits.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Annie Shontag. I'm managing partner at KTA. Athen has done an incredible job being the Irondequoit expert on this project. And having written some similar surveys for other places, I just want to emphasize what a wonderful challenge it was, because not only is this a really, really large survey area, it's very hard to stay in kind of a zoomed out perspective with 20,000 buildings. And B, because there's so much information already out there, there's such good documentation, so many good maps, and C, because the architectural integrity, the condition of the buildings still really tells that story in a lot of places. So I think we were delightfully surprised to see how much we found would become or should become, as we recommend officially in the report, National Register eligible. So it's a really difficult task and a really fun challenge to kind of try and keep zooming out rather than tell a full comprehensive history of Irondequoit and see what those kind of initial impressions as if it's just a quick glance, right? But it's been a year of studying all of these resources and methodologies together. So I'm just going to talk way more briefly about some of the impacts of what could happen as a result of this report and sort of what some of these terms mean. So as Athan has already said, National Register, which I should clarify, in the report, we only recommend that these individual properties and these districts become National Register eligible. We make a case for it. It's kind of like being a lawyer for the past, right? So we write this all up, we provide this in this very extensive report, and then we send it off to SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and they determine, they either say yes or no. That's out of our hands. We make the case, they're the judge. If they determine all of these or some of these National Register eligible, that is basically a first step towards becoming National Register listed. So we are not listing anything on the National Register as part of this report. This survey, as surveys typically are sort of that initial planning tool that allow eligibility is essentially required before you proceed with National Register nominations, which are also a somewhat extensive process, particularly for large districts, but a lot more manageable for individual properties as well. So there's ways to become on the National Register. Again, there's these 4 criteria. They're each designed in the 1960s as part of the original National Historic Preservation Act to be somewhat broad but somewhat specific. So we're constantly kind of towing the line of what argument to make. So C with architecture, for instance, is pretty obvious. Does the building look like a really good example of style? Is it really unique? Is it really old and still conveys that age? Are the materials intact, et cetera? B is typically, did George Washington sleep here? That kind of association. A is really kind of the broadest and is constantly being changed in how it's being used, much to sort of SHPO's chagrin sometimes. A includes not only major events and trends, but also social history, which can really mean a whole lot of things. It can mean the history of redlining, the history of automobile use, transportation. A also can include industry, commerce, so really broad sort of trends and themes in that way. D is typically archaeological value, so pretty obvious there. So what is National Register listing and what would that mean should your property become within a National Register listed district? It is really honorific. It's not there to regulate you. So it's not saying what you can't do with the property. And I'll say this, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about what National Register means for a property owner. Essentially, as a shorthand, the only thing you can't do to a National Register property is demolish it using any portion of government funds, state, city, or federal. If you want to change the color of your house, if you want to change the interior, you can do that. But if you do it in ways that SHPO and the National Park Service likes, you can actually get money for doing that. So that's a lot of what we also navigate at different stages of a project. So these surveys are really the first step to sort of opening the door for the potential of enabling those incentives through listing. So districts, as he said, are sometimes quite straightforward, like in the Arlington district where you can walk through or drive through and the buildings look very similar. They're clearly made by the same developer for a similar group of home buyers at a particular time. Other times they're more complicated, like St. Paul, not just because of its size, but because of its sort of irregular boundaries due to topography and multiple subdivisions all at once. So those multiple subdivisions over time really do tell a cohesive story that we argue it does, which is really the history of eventual streetcar to automobile-based suburbs. So that is a single story, but it is, of course, a very broad, nuanced, complex story that happens over decades. So part of a National Register eligibility discussion is really clearly defining boundaries. So this is where all those subdivision maps that he showed come in handy, where often those subdivision maps give us our answers really easily. They're very justifiable. We literally have to write paragraphs of justifying a boundary. Why it ends here and not there, right? Why is my neighbor's house in and I'm not, or vice versa? It's largely due to how the subdivision was originally laid out, if we have that information, but it's also due to architectural integrity, right? If there's an end of a street where many houses in a row, for instance, have all been changed or are all really young, or have all been what we call muddled, meaning they don't look much like they would have looked during what we call the period of significance. So the examples that are already eligible are Wimbledon is already listed. So does anybody here live in the Wimbledon district Great. Oh, well, you know the rules. And the others are eligible. So right now, even before our survey, anyone, should the funding and the initiative and the interest amongst the property owners there arise, you could apply for listing through the nomination process for these other 3 districts, and then be able to take advantage of those tax incentives and have increased protections. So I just want to clarify the difference between National Register District and local district. So National Register District, as I said, it's really more honorific than regulatory. It is approved by the Secretary of the Interior. It's a federal designation. It also always comes with state designation. So technically, National Register listed properties are 99.9% also state listed. Individual properties are eligible or contributing. So we're proposing this huge St. Paul Boulevard district, but that doesn't mean 4,500 properties are contributing. Usually, in order to become a National Register eligible district, you typically have to have the vast majority of the properties be contributing. But of course, that's when a nomination process goes through and literally makes those determinations one by one for every property in the district. So only contributing properties are then eligible for tax credits, should they choose to use them. It's a whole survey of defining boundaries, as you've seen, and it provides this opportunity for tax incentives. Now, that's really the key difference in a lot of people's minds, because local districts, every local preservation board has its own set of rules, but they tend to, statewide, be a little stricter on what you can and can't do, or what kind of appeals process is there for getting permits towards what you want to do to your property. And they typically do not offer financial incentives for doing so. So little more rules, much higher protections in that regard, much harder to demolish or change in a local district, but doesn't usually offer huge financial incentives to do so. So you can be both. There are many districts in the state that are both local districts and National Register districts, which means no matter what, you still have to go through the local rigmarole, but you do get the money from the National Register tax incentive should you choose to go through that process. So what is that process like? I'm not going to go through this in huge depth, but essentially this is tailored more towards homeowners than towards commercial, but essentially there is the homeowner paperwork is designed by the government to be, quote unquote, easy for anyone to use. Now, government paperwork, I can't even file my own taxes. So basically, there are a few things you have to do to be able to apply with this paperwork. So you have to be in a National Register district as a contributing building. The rehab has a few rules that have to be in accordance to the Secretary of Interior Standards of Rehabilitation. I'll talk a little bit about that. You have to be in an eligible census tract, which most of Western New York now is. And the residence has to be owner-occupied. There can be rental units. For instance, I am a homeowner in Buffalo in a National Register district. I have a 3-unit property, which one of the units I rent out. So I qualify in some ways as both homeowner and commercial. And you have to spend at least $5,000 for them to think it's worth going through the paperwork. And of that $5,000, 5% of it has to be spent in the exterior of the building. Basically, you're contributing back to your community in that way. Now, as we all know, $5,000 of qualifying work goes by really quickly these days. So it's usually pretty easy to hit that mark. They just don't want you to do it for like a new mailbox or something very small. This work must be done to preserve the overall character. So the idea is to repair the historic character that's still there. So if you have clapboard siding, they want to incentivize you to keep that clapboard siding and repair it, maybe repaint it. They know that it's more expensive to deal with historic houses, so the point is to kind of help offset that cost to maintain the historic character. But if you have vinyl siding, and your historic siding's gone, you don't have to put anything back. If something's already gone, you don't have to put it back. So all things that are qualifying is the way that there's a whole list here, but the way that I think of it is if a giant in some sort of fairy tale came and shook the building, anything that doesn't fall out qualifies. So painting, siding, windows, electrical, plumbing, floors, really anything. Cabinets even sometimes, appliances, no, not usually. Unfortunately, landscaping, garages, fences, driveways, patios, those don't count. But anything of the mass unit of the house, if you shook it and it didn't fall out, it qualifies. So $5,000 can add up pretty quickly. So the process is basically a 2-step process for a homeowner. they file what's called the part 1 and 2 together as one step, and then the part 3 afterwards. So it's a before and after is an easy way to think of it. So you basically take photos of everything, of the whole house, just broad views of the house inside and out. The idea is someone in Albany is trying to get a sense of the general layout and conditions of your house without ever stepping foot in it, and they want to see the before. So you have to apply for this before work, should you be able to do this. You fill out essentially what is like a chart that says, okay, the work proposed, usually a photo keyed to it, and then says, what's the existing condition? Like old windows breaking and sash cord not, balanced. And then you say, what are you going to do? Like, okay, restore glazing, repair, carpentry, rebalance sash, And that's language that you can take from a contractor if you're using a contractor too. So that can be pretty easy copy-paste. And then you say an estimated cost. That can be a cost that a contractor gave you, or most likely. If that number doesn't match up at the end, that's okay. Give them the number that it did actually cost. Never had anyone have to show receipts, but it's not a bad idea to keep them. So then you do the work. First you get an approval. SHPO reviews your work. They send you a letter digitally that says, go ahead, here's your official document, here's your project number. You do the work. You have to do it within 24 months of when you got that approval. And then you say, okay, it's done. You take pictures of all the work that's been done, showing the after, and you fill out another chart that says, here's what I said I'd do, here's what we did, here's how much it cost. And by this point, you use the exact numbers of what it cost. So then they tally that all up, and if you're just a homeowner, then you only get state credit. And credit is not a reimbursement unless you make under $60,000 a year. It is a tax credit. So say you owe $10,000 in state income tax at the end of the year, say you get $6,000 for your qualifying work, that comes off your bill, right? So you can get a lot more credits than $6,000. You get 20% of all your qualifying expenses. So if you spend $100,000, you get $20,000 of state tax credit. So, and that's for doing work that you were probably going to do anyway, maybe at a slightly higher cost, but definitely offsets it. So some things are tricky, other things are not, but it is designed for the homeowner project to just be able to do this on your own in conversation with a contractor. So this is really good. This is why National Register districts are such a great tool, because you're not having to go building by building, writing a National Register nomination for your own house every time. It may be really interesting, it may be really historic, but if you can do this in a community where you're writing one big nomination for over 4,000 buildings, then you have 4,000 homeowners that qualify for this money, and it really puts money back into the community and into your pockets in order to do this. Plus it maintains the character, maintains property values. There is no research to show that it raises property taxes in any way. Your house might look nice, so in that sense, sure, but this is a totally voluntary program. This district could be listed, you could be in it, you could be contributing, and you could be saying, no, I want to put in vinyl windows, I want to add a weird addition to my house, and I want to make a rooftop disco. And as long as you're not in a local district, the National Register district, you can do that. You just aren't going to be incentivized by the government to do those changes. So it's totally voluntary. Only all carrot, no stick is really the way that we think about the tax credit program. There is a additional commercial. This is a very largely residential community that we're proposing in each district, but for commercial buildings within those, they can get both 20% state tax credit and 20 to 30% federal credits as well. So it's really highly incentivized for commercial. The commercial application is a little bit more tricky. That's the kind of work that our firm often does, but I'm happy to answer questions about that too. So essentially, to review, once you're done, you get that Part 3 letter that says, yes, you did what you said you'd do, you spent this amount of money, here's your qualifying expenditure. It's just a letter, and then you put that in your taxes in a particular line or tell your accountant to figure it out. So it's always as a credit unless your adjusted gross income is under $60,000. So, and in which case you do get a check for those qualifying expenses. All right, questions? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the qualifying districts are historically they're determined by if it is the median income for the state or lower within a census district. So not just a zip code, but census districts, as we know, can be kind of all over the place. Who knows how those lines are drawn sometimes. I've never had a case in which, because I work primarily in Erie County and Niagara County, in which every single census district qualifies. I'll double check, but what I suspect strongly would happen would be that it wouldn't change the district from being eligible, but if your property was specifically in a district that wasn't, or in a census district that wasn't, then you wouldn't be qualifying. But I strongly suspect that all of Irondequoit maybe does now, because they recently rechanged that, is it not?
There's one still,
There's one that's not, okay.
which is an improvement.
Okay,
There were two
yeah,
districts
they've
where
been
not.
trying to make it that more can take advantage of this, but Western New York in general has been the largest applicants and highest number of users and money gained from the historic tax credit system in America. So, worth doing.
We talked a lot about the agriculture. First, I want to thank you and thank Chris and the Conservation Board and the Historic Society for all the great work that you've done. It's just amazing. I don't think that we have done enough to preserve our history in Irondequoit. And so I'm looking forward to doing whatever we can to facilitate that for the future. We looked at a lot of the architectural pieces. Have you looked at the cultural pieces? Like, for example, one of the stories is that the Peacemaker landed here in Irondequoit, unifying the Haudenosaunee Nation. The difference of the different immigrant groups, like we have a Ukrainian church that was built by Ukrainian immigrants who were there on hands. The Italian immigrant way, the Polish and Irish. There's a lot of cultural pieces. How do we preserve that cultural piece integrated with the agricultural piece in the future?
Yeah, so fantastic question and very important. There are aspects of that that already exist within the report that I just didn't talk about today, but not all of them. And that's because it's a reconnaissance level survey. And so as you're moving forward, as communities move forward, if they decide they want to do an intensive level survey, they can look to this report, see how their particular neighborhood fits in, or whatever story they're trying to think about fits in, and revise the broad reconnaissance level survey and say, so all of that's true, yes, but then there's this piece right here that we haven't looked at closely enough. And so you can slowly tile together more and more history over time. It's just a baseline starting point. It's much easier to go about telling those stories when you have some kind of physical remnant to talk about it. It doesn't always have to be the case. Like White City's a good example. There's not that much physical remnant left over, but there's enough to still be able to tell a story about it. So like the two Ukrainian churches that are here in Irondequoit were built in like the late 20th century, but are still within historic significance time bracket and very interesting stories, and it spans a much broader area than just right here. I'm sure there are more stories, there's no doubt.
So what you're saying that Christensen has a lot more work to do?
Oh yes.
Is this report online?
Not yet.
But it will be?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I will say it is designed, we're required to follow certain format and use type of languages that is aimed specifically at the State Historic Preservation Office. So it's not, there might be points that as a general public you're like really bored or not really sure what we're talking about. That's just the requirements of this particular type of survey, but Athena has made it really kind of legible through the form of hyperlinks where you can click on any particular part, and there's lots of visuals and things too. So, and there's tons of citations for looking more into something on your own as well. So yeah, typically they're posted on town websites after. It's probably being submitted officially this week or next, so we're waiting for that. Anything else? Okay, yeah.
I'm just curious about commercial pieces. You've talked about the residential. Could you just touch on commercial pieces that might be eligible?
Of the individually eligible, how many are roughly?
I don't know that I could say that. The individually eligible, there are maybe 4 or 5 buildings that caught our attention while we were working. I'm sure there are more, particularly commercial buildings that are integrated within subdivisions or within neighborhoods. So there's one on North Clinton Street that's, yes, you're nodding your head. It's in Seneca side. And then there's the Stein Block, which is up on Culver Road near Seabreeze. That's a Mission Revival yellow building. So there are 2 commercial buildings. There are others as well. And especially if the commercial building falls within the district, even if it's not a residential building and it's a residential district, it still contributes to that history. And it oftentimes was built in order to serve the immediate community surrounding it. So it's still a part of that building and would still be eligible. Also, if there's a particular commercial building that really has significant interest, like the Grange building, the House of Guitars, it would be eligible even without the House of Guitars, but with the House of Guitars, it is, of course, eligible. So there are instances where just an individual commercial building could be listed as is without any connection to a district, certainly.
Commercial, as I mentioned, is a really, being listed as a commercial building is a really good financial tool for historic tax credits. So it's really typical in taking if there's an eligible individual commercial building somewhere, we do recommend that pursues a nomination as well if there's interest in rehabilitating it, because it's really good for the economy, it's good for the building, it keeps that history alive. So, and there's, you get basically 40%. If you spend less than $2 million on a rehabilitation for a commercial project, this is a somewhat new program, you actually get 30% back from the state. So that means you'd get 50% back total in tax credits. So that's a game changer for commercial development in communities like this one. So we always kind of recommend prioritizing that if there's an owner that has interest. The owner does have to consent in order to individually list in that case. Anything else? There will be plenty to read when this goes live. Enjoy all 300 pages.
250 of them right here.
There you go. Yeah, the commission's been really good at reviewing it along the way, so.
It's beautiful, actually. It's wonderful.
All right, well, thank you. Chris has our contact if there's any questions, and we're happy to chat if need be. But thanks for your attention and your interest in your own history and community.
Thank you.
It's been nice getting